Hey guys, what we're going to talk about today is a mapping technique called a KWL chart. This is it. That's what it looks like. It might look familiar to you. Maybe you've already done one of these. If you're in high school, a lot of different teachers, regardless of the subject, use this technique. Or even at Mount Sac, maybe you've had another teacher use it there, especially if you've had a reading class. It's really popular in classes where you're analyzing the process of your own literacy. It can also be a map for learning, and that's how we're going to use it. We're going to use this map to justify some of the techniques we use for analysis in this class. Now, normally in a physical classroom, I would have you all break up into groups and give you a poster and a pen, and then we would take something that you're already familiar with and we would dissect it using this map. We don't have the luxury of that, right? So instead, I'm just going to go through the process with you, okay? We're going to take it one element at a time and we're going to apply it to something that hopefully most of you are pretty familiar with, okay? Here's the topic. The topic is Little Red Riding Hood, right? I bet most of you are probably familiar with that story. You heard it when you were a kid, you saw versions of it, there are movies of it, it's all over the place. If you haven't heard of it, okay, that's okay. Don't worry about it. The point is we're taking something that's fairly simple and we're looking at the overall complexity of it because we're mapping out different parts of it. Here's what I mean by that, okay? The very first column is the K column. K stands for know, K-N-O-W. What do you know about a thing? For example, with the story Little Red Riding Hood, even if it's been a while since I've heard the story or read the story or seen it on TV, there are still pieces of it that I remember. It's something that I'm at least familiar with, right? So, what do I know about Little Red Riding Hood? Well, here's where I would take out my pen and I'd start making bullet points, okay? I remember a red cloak. That's significant in the story. I don't remember all the details about it, but I know there was a red cloak, so I could just write red cloak right there, right? I know Little Red Riding Hood is a little girl. I could write that. I know that there was a wolf, I know that there was a grandmother, I know there was a basket of goodies or something like that. So those are the elements that I would put in that column. Anything I can remember that I'm pretty certain about, I'm going to put that in the know section. I know these things are true about the story of Little Red Riding Hood. Now the W column is what you want to know, okay? In other words, what questions do you have about this thing? What questions do I have about the story of Little Red Riding Hood? Well, if there's something I sort of remember, well, then maybe there are details that I could ask questions about. I remember that there was a red cloak, but I don't remember what the significance of it was. Was there some significance to the color red? I could put that in want to know. I remember that there was some violence in the story having to do with the wolf and I think like a lumberjack or a woodsman or a hunter or something like that. I could put that in question form right there. I remember that I think there was also some violence towards the grandmother somehow. I could put that there. What happened to the grandmother? What happened to Little Red? Anything like that. Any question that you have, you put in the W column. Now the L column is the last column because it's what you learned about a thing. So this is after the fact. After we've talked about what we know and after we've come up with questions, then we actually read the story and we look for answers basically. And when we get those answers, that's what we've learned. So we can put that there. Oh, I learned what was in that basket of food. I learned what happened to the grandmother. If any of these questions get answered, you could put that over here. Also, if you get any new information, even if you didn't think to put it into a question form, if there was something new that you did learn, you put that in that column. Now that's it, okay? That's basically what the KWL actually is. Now, the reason I wanted to show you this technique is because it's not just a learning activity. It's not just a way of forming thoughts before you learn something new. It can be, it's really good for that. But it's also a really interesting model of your brain, what's going on in your mind when you're learning something new. And it also gives you a way of turning on certain tools, things that are in your brain that you can turn on when you want to and help you learn something more deeply, basically, more thoroughly. It helps you to be more engaged in the learning process. Here's what I mean by that, okay? So here's a different way of looking at this KWL chart. So again, let's take this one element at a time. We started with the K column, right? What you know about a thing. And we said That was just information that you already had. If you were already familiar with the story of Little Red Riding Hood, whatever you could remember, you wrote in that column. There's a nice, fancy, technical, scientific word for that in academia, okay? And it's called schema. Schema is just what you already know. It's knowledge, right? Everybody has schema. The interesting thing about schema is you can use it for your own learning. It's something that you can activate and actually learn something in a more profound way, in a deeper way, and in a more meaningful way because you're using schema. The reason why is when you have schema, when you have this old knowledge and you're about to learn something new, you can take that new knowledge and you can apply it, stick it to the old knowledge that you had, and by doing that, those pieces fit together. The new knowledge now makes more sense, okay? It has more meaning for you because it's causing this old information to make more sense. You're taking these pieces and adding them together, basically. I want to give you a more concrete example of what I mean by activating schema and how you can use it to your advantage, okay? I'm going to tell you a story, okay? When I was a kid, I played the saxophone. I was in the band from the 5th grade on through high school. I played the alto sax, okay? First time I picked up an alto saxophone, it sounded terrible. If you've ever picked up an instrument for the first time, you probably know what I mean. The first time you pick it up, you don't know how to get the right sound out of it. You don't know where your fingers go. It's a totally foreign activity the first time you do it. However, if you stick with it and you practice it, you start to develop a feel for this thing, right? You understand just the right pressure to apply with your lips, and your fingers just start to naturally go to the right place, and you can move them around to make the different notes. After a while, you don't even have to think about it. The reason why is because you're building up schema, okay? You're creating knowledge by practicing and learning how to use this thing, okay? So that's how schema is built. Here's how schema is transferred, okay? Another story. When I was much older, when I was an adult, just on a lark, I bought a flute, okay? I was near a pawn shop, and I saw a flute in the window, and I'd always been interested in the flute. I don't know why. I like the sound of it, and it just kind of fascinated me. And I saw this thing, and it was a good price, so just on a whim, I just bought the thing. I brought it home. I had no experience with flutes at all, okay? I brought this thing home, I took it out, and I would say within about 10 minutes, I could play a song on that flute. Now, why is that? It was a brand new instrument to me, but I was able to pick it up in 10 minutes. So how do you explain that? It's because of schema. I had saxophone schema. Here's what I didn't know at the time. When I bought that flute, I had no idea. The fingering on a saxophone, the way you put your fingers, is exactly the same as the fingering on a flute. I don't know if you knew that. I didn't know that. I discovered that totally by accident. But when I picked up this flute and put it in my hands, my fingers just naturally gravitated to the right keys because it already knew how to play a saxophone. And by pure luck, it just happens to be the same placement, basically. So other than learning how to get the correct sound out, because that is different than a saxophone, once I figured out how to do that, I already had the fingering down. I could play notes on this thing, and I knew exactly what I was doing. And that's because of schema, okay? I was taking old knowledge and applying it to something new, and it made the new experience so much easier and so much more meaningful. I had understanding already that I could apply to this new activity. Now that's not just, it doesn't just apply to picking up an instrument, it applies to anything that you're about to learn, right? If you have old information that you can apply to the new information, it makes the new information more meaningful and you learn it better. If you've ever noticed in textbooks, especially college level textbooks, very often they'll have terms, right? The very first page, when you get to chapter 1, before you even start reading, it has a list of terms. Well, why are they doing that? You don't know the terms yet. You haven't read the chapter. It's because they're activating your schema. That textbook is actually doing a really sneaky thing, right? It's having you look at these words. And there's a chance that you might recognize some of those words because you have life experience. You've been a student for most of your life. So maybe you took a bio class when you were in high school, or maybe you saw a documentary on TV once a few years ago. maybe some of these terms are going to seem familiar to you. Oh, wait, this thing right here, I kind of remember that, and I kind of remember what it is. They're activating your schema, okay? They're causing you to rethink about the things that you already know, and they're priming your brain for new information to come. Kind of a sneaky thing, but it's kind of a neat thing, because that means you can use this to your advantage, right? That's what that textbook is doing. It's putting that list of terms there because it knows that by activating this old knowledge that you have, you can now take that and learn this new information more easily. That's what's going on with that K column. Now, we said the next column was the W column. What do you want to know about a thing? And we said that what you want to know ultimately comes down to questions, right? Asking questions. Why would it be important to ask questions? Especially when you're about to learn something new. Why should you ask questions about that thing before you learn about that thing? Have you ever noticed, again, at the beginning of the chapter, when you're reading a textbook, sometimes it'll have questions. Well, that's kind of interesting. Why would it be asking you questions before you read the chapter? How the heck should you know? You haven't read the chapter yet, right? Well, they've already activated your schema by showing you a list of terms. Now what they're doing is giving you a purpose for reading, and that's what questioning actually does. It gives you a purpose. The reason why is because when you have a purpose in your reading, it actually makes you read in a different way. Let's say as an activity, we were talking about Little Red Riding Hood, right? That was the topic of this KWL. So let's suppose we're in a classroom, a physical classroom, and we're all grouped together, and I have you fill out the K and the W. I have you fill out that column. What questions do you have about the story of Little Red Riding Hood? Then after I do that, I actually read you the story of Little Red Riding Hood, right? I get out my book and I read it to you guys. What's the connection between coming up with those questions and now me reading you the story? Because you're going to be listening in a different way. Because by coming up with those questions, what is your brain doing now? Even if you're not conscious of it, it's searching for the answers. As I'm reading the story of Little Red Riding Hood, part of your brain has been clicked on, and it's actually actively looking for the answers to the questions that you came up with. If one of your questions was, why was she called Little Red Riding Hood? That means part of your brain is now looking for the answer to that question. Well, why was she called Little Red Riding Hood? And as soon as you hear that answer, when I'm reading the beginning of the story, your brain is going to latch onto that and say, oh, wait a minute, I had that question, and now I've got an answer to that question, right? So it turns you into an active listener, basically, which is also an active learner. You weren't just passively listening to me read the story of Little Red Riding Hood. You were actively listening. You were searching for those answers. And what that did by filling out that column was it gave your brain a purpose. It went from passive to active, right? All of that happened just because I had you come up with questions. And that's why that's so important. And then finally, we had the L section. What did you learn? And this is what you fill out after the fact. So after I read you the story of Little Red Riding Hood, that's when I would have you go back and fill out anything that you learned, basically. And the things that you learn are knowledge, okay? Anything you know, anything you've learned, that is knowledge, okay? Pretty simple. Everything you know is knowledge. Now, notice that this map has the same information basically as this map, but it's constructed a little bit differently, and here's why, okay? If you consider how these three elements are interrelated, this one doesn't show it so much, but consider what I'm doing here right now. Look what I'm doing. I'm adding arrows into this thing, into this diagram, basically turning it into a cycle, a circle, right? Here's why. Think of it this way. Like I said, everybody has schema. Everybody has knowledge. Everybody has a little bit of knowledge about something, right? When you have that knowledge, it means that you know something. And when you know what you know, you also know that there are things that you don't know. So that enables you to come up with questions. Okay, I know she had a red cloak, but I don't know why she wore the red cloak. That led to a question, didn't it? So here we are over here. Okay, now I'm coming up with questions. And when I come up with questions, I'm actively looking for the answers. And when I find those answers, I've now learned something new. I have knowledge, right? And when I have new knowledge, what do I actually have? I have more schema. So do you see how this thing is self-perpetuating? This cycle reinforces itself and pushes itself forward. It's always happening. Now, the reason why I wanted to show you this is because this is a representation of what's going on in your brain. For example, do you think I actually expect you to fill out a KWL chart every time you're going to learn something new in school? You know, you're about to learn a new chapter, so are you going to go home and get out a poster, a big piece of paper and a pen and write KWL and fill out this thing? I mean, that's awesome if you did do that. It's helpful. But here's the point. You don't have to, because this is all internalized. And the way it's internalized is because the process is already there. However, you can activate it. You can turn it on. This thing's already there. It's already going on. But if you're aware of it, if you're aware of these three elements, then you can turn them on purpose, okay? Let's say you're about to read a new chapter. Well, even before you do that, you can start considering some of these elements and activating them. You can activate your knowledge, even if that chapter doesn't have a bunch of terms on the first page. It's got a title, and you can look at that title, and that title might remind you of something that you already know. You can already, excuse me, you can already start to make connections based on whatever little information you have just from the first page of that textbook, right? That chapter. So you can activate your own schema. And once you do that, that causes you to start thinking of questions. So you can actively start coming up with questions about this text, this chapter you're about to read before you read it. Okay, you can do all of these things. And while you're reading it, you can be looking for the answers to the questions you had before you started reading it. And you're doing this guy right here. You're adding to your knowledge when you find those answers. This cycle is happening. And if you're aware of it happening, there's this term called metacognition, and it's really important in education. Metacognition simply means being aware of your own learning, right? Being aware of your own thinking. It's like stepping outside yourself and thinking about your own thinking. That's what's going on here. You're not just thinking, you're thinking about your own thinking. And when you do that, when you step back from it and look at it at a distance, you can analyze the whole process and you can turn it on and activate it when you want to. So that's really what's going on here. That's why teachers use this guy. They may not explicitly tell you that that's why they're using it, but that is why they're using it. It's because they understand that this whole process is going on in your brain and they're just helping you along. Textbooks understand that. They're helping you along by having these elements built into the chapter without even telling you that that's what's going on. So that's it, guys. That is the KWL chart, all right?